Everywhere. All right, I'm taking you out. Good evening. Welcome to Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua. Today we have a special guest, an old friend, someone that I've known since the 1980s, Dr. Dave Crockett. He is a professor of marketing research, formerly at the University of South Carolina. He is on his way to the great city of Chicago, where he will be a professor of marketing research at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Now, Dr. Crockett's primary research interest is behavior, consumer behavior, and he's mainly interested in its sociological aspects, particularly the consequences of economic inequality. He investigates the creation, manifestation, and resolution of class and racial inequality in the marketplace, and he addresses public policy initiatives designed to alleviate inequality. Let me bring on Dr. Crockett.
Good evening, and thanks for having me. Let me just say, in opening, how much Dr. Cha-Jua has meant to me on my intellectual and personal journey. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's such an honor for me to be here.
Oh, thank you so much, Dave. So, Dave, because of my relationship with Helen,
Hmm.
my wife, I've picked up this psychology stuff,
Right.
right? So I'm always concerned about the critical incidents that
Hmm.
one experiences that helps them become the person that they are,
Hmm.
particularly in terms of politics and ideology.
Hmm.
So I begin by always asking a couple of biographical questions.
Sure.
So what I'd like to ask you to do, right? We want to kind of excavate your social background. So when and where were you born?
Hmm.
Where did you spend your formative years? And how did your class background, the place where you were raised, and the historical moment, right? How did
Hmm.
that impact your developing political consciousness? And in essence, I want to know how you developed the set of politics that
Hmm.
guides your research and your activism.
Sure thing. Well, I will start by saying that it has taken me a long time to be able to kind of craft a story around those things. So I'll probably give more detail here than I'm used to giving. So I'll ask the audience to bear with me a bit. But there are a lot of moving parts. So I was born in 1971 in Trenton, New Jersey. I was adopted as an infant by a couple who both died prematurely from the things that Black people die prematurely of, namely hypertension and alcoholism. So by the age of 7, I left Trenton to live with another relative in upstate New York, in Rochester, and very briefly before returning back to New Jersey, to East Orange, to live with my maternal grandfather and my uncle, my mom's brother. And I lived with them from the start of third grade to the start of high school. My uncle, who was my legal guardian, he died from colon cancer and lung cancer during the fall semester of my freshman year of high school. And I ended up going to St. Louis to live with his eldest son, wife, and 2 girls. And that's my family. That's who I call mom and pop. So I moved to near North County, St. Louis. For those of you who are familiar with St. Louis, you might know Northwoods. Um, and so that happened halfway through my freshman year of high school. Um, I mentioned some of these details because maybe somewhat differently than a lot of people that I know, I can probably chart my political development pretty cleanly. So the genesis for me was early on simply perceiving distinctions and what I would later uh, come to call or find out was called cultural capital, right? In the Pierre Bourdieu sense of the word. That is, every time I changed family situation, every time I changed household, I could see that there were these somewhat maybe mild but noticeable differences in what I later came to understand was social class. So even though all of these settings were predominantly Black, life in them was lived differently. Life in each one was lived a little bit differently. People talked differently and they talked about different kinds of things, in ways that, really at that age, I didn't have a vocabulary for, they were part of my intuition, but I didn't understand them. When I was very young, my mother and father, so Arlene and Henry Crockett, they both worked irregularly. My mom was a domestic worker. My father was a construction worker. Um, so we were poor. And let me emphasize, we were poor. So, when my parents passed and I went to go live with the sister-in-law in Rochester, she worked as an assembly line worker for AC Delco, so blue collar working class. When I moved back to East Orange, my uncle was a machinist, and my grandfather was a retired Baptist minister. So, like a little bit. And then when I moved to St. Louis, my folks were I sort of describe them as blue collar middle class. My pop was a union worker at General Motors. He worked as an electrician on the plant that has long since closed in St. Louis. My mother was a master's degree holding nurse who worked as a drug and alcohol rehab counselor for the Veterans Administration, right? And so you can sort of see how in each of these places I could perceive these differences, which gave me, by the time I got to high school, I had a strong intuition and sense about inequality, and that it was unjust, it was unfair, but that was kind of as far as it went. I didn't have at that time a vocabulary to really describe that stuff or a framework for understanding them, much less thinking about how things could be different until I enrolled at the University of Missouri. And as a freshman, I mean, and I would say even before that, I had been reading Black literature since the seventh and eighth grade. So I had read the autobiography and I'd read Things Fall Apart and Down These Mean Streets, right? And a number of other books, Man Child in the Promised Land. I read, the classics, right? But it was when I took my first history course at the University of Missouri with Dr. Cha-Jua that I started to get some tools to help me make sense of my own life, and how that life fit into the world around me. And like I said, I had a strong intuition about inequality, but I didn't have a way of thinking about it. And so it was there that I began to cultivate and develop those things. And I'll just kind of say, because I don't want to take the whole show up with this. Um, at the end of my college career, I knew I was going to go to graduate school. I had been in business, and in large part because I'd taken several classes with Dr. Cha-Jua. I had really strongly considered going to graduate school to become a historian, like my mentor. But he actually said something to me that has proven prophetic, prophetic, and very much part of what has guided me along the way. He said, you could go to graduate school, and I'm sure you would work hard and you become a fine historian. But we don't have people who have your sensibility doing this kind of work, right, in the field that you're in. And so, he gave me a very, very different kind of cast your buckets where you are sort of speech. And I've always appreciated that. And that's been a part of kind of how my politics have developed from there.
Dave, I truly appreciate it. And, I'm actually there was a time when we probably talked, what, once every couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, this is the first I'm hearing some of the details in terms of your
Mm-hmm.
background.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the audience is really getting great insight there.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us your background. And
Mm-hmm.
now I've been doing. I made a decision to start doing series of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been dealing with economics for the past four programs.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had on Jessica Gordon Nimhard talking about
Mm-hmm.
cooperative economics,
Mm-hmm.
James Stewart talking about stratification economics, and my colleague in Black Power Media
Mm-hmm.
family, Jared Ball, and he's in communication, but he's got that brilliant book out on black buying power,
Oh man.
exploding that myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another economic. And now I got you, and
Mm-hmm.
you also you're working in a different area in terms of consumption,
Mm-hmm.
consumer behavior. And so one concern I have, and I looked at some data.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, this stuff is scary, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so
Right.
between 2011 and 2017, only 15 black people in the entirety of the United States
Mm-hmm.
received a PhD from a top 20 economic department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
I was blown away
Mm-hmm.
last year because I discovered that in 2019, only 32 black people received a PhD in history out of 616,
Mm-hmm.
but 15 in 8 years.
Yeah.
Okay. So, with that background,
Mm-hmm.
it would be easy to simply say that economics and marketing hasn't been incorporated into Black studies, Black
Mm-hmm.
Africana studies,
Mm-hmm.
because of the low numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an easy out,
Yeah.
and it's certainly more depth. So, can you speak to some of the more subtle and nuanced ways
Mm-hmm.
and the impact of the lack of a large cadre of
Sure.
black folk in black studies who are concerned with political economy?
Sure, sure. I mean, this is a very interesting question, and I don't want to spend much time on the economics discipline. In fact, I would add that my own discipline, the numbers are almost certainly worse. The numbers of Black
Mm,
scholars are almost certainly lower. There's an econ program everywhere, right? There's not a marketing program everywhere,
mhm,
right? So you start with those sorts of issues, but the same sorts of things I think apply. Um, so we're going to set that to the side for a minute. And so I'll start by saying I think consumers and consumption are, as you know, they're not well integrated into Black or Africana studies. And that's for certain. I would characterize the problem as they are invisible more than they are ignored. And I think
mm,
the subtle distinction there is critical. So what I find is that a lot of people who, so there are lots of historians whose work I respect and try to incorporate into my own, and lots of other folks who are in the Black studies kind of, in that constellation of scholars.
mhm,
Um, and I would say that many of us work on the same kinds of substantive issues. If they're doing anything kind of related to everyday life, popular culture, et cetera, et cetera, I would say that it's uncommon for folks to frame their work as being about consumers and consumption, right? And so that's kind of what I mean by invisible. In many ways, many of us are talking about some of the same kinds of issues. The framing is different. And I don't think that that is trivial. I think one of the problems with not recognizing consumers and consumption um, as kind of what people are and what they're doing is that these things end up under theorized. And so, the explanations that you're getting about things that people are doing in the marketplace, a lot of times I think could benefit from the kind of work that I do, But oftentimes the sorts of assumptions that people make about consumers and what they're doing are often pretty naive. Um, we'll talk a little bit about the marketing blackness paper, but in some ways that was part of my motivation for writing that paper. Um, and this stuff really matters, because if we fail to recognize the marketplace as a legitimate site of struggle, right? There's a whole lot of history that we're ignoring, and it's a site of struggle potentially every bit as consequential as the workplace, right? If Black people are paying more, all things equal, for pretty much everything from household groceries to credit, it literally offsets any kind of progressive labor struggle for better pay, right? And so you add to that, there's some long time polling data, I believe from Nielsen, that shows that Black people name the marketplace as the most common site of unfair treatment. That's more than the workplace, even more than their encounters with the police. They name the marketplace. Now, the other sort of problem with ignoring it and kind of under theorizing it, is, there are moments too, I think, when the kind of work that I do, and not just my work, could speak to some of the other sorts of issues. So one example comes immediately to mind. There are a lot of people, and not just scholars here, but it's become sort of popular for people to talk about wanting more exploration of Black joy. So this is just one example. I'm all in, right? I want some more of that too. But if you're failing to consider consumers and consumption, that can lead to an uncritical celebration of sometimes what just amounts to petty bourgeois elitism and commodity fetishism. Those things can be conflated with Black joy. They don't have to be, obviously, but I think that a perspective that centers consumers and fit that kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just hit on something that really speaks to this moment in the ways in which political economy, and particularly that point you made about that its survey data suggests that it is the marketplace, it's the field of consumption where
Mm-hmm.
where Black people experience the most racial discrimination.
Right.
And in some ways, one might say that there's a kind of irony there, because much of the whole notion of the capitalist literature on
Mm-hmm.
the marketplace is that the marketplace corrects
Right.
for biases rooted in race and in other identity
Mm-hmm.
formations.
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, we're gonna get to that with some of the more recent stuff that I've been doing. No, this is absolutely true, right? And so there's a way in which the marketplace is a site of struggle, both for inclusion, on decent terms,
Hmm.
but it's also, kind of part of a larger struggle around unfairness. There's nothing inherent in the marketplace that shields anyone from discriminatory, and let me actually rephrase, nothing shades you from exclusionary behavior on the part of others or predatory inclusion, right? And so people are constantly struggling in the marketplace. And I don't mean to suggest that what happens in the marketplace is somehow worse than what happens in other sites of struggle. But I do think it's more ubiquitous, right? Like everyone has to consume, right? There's no getting around that. It's impossible to not do that. And so there's no reckoning with contemporary Black life without reckoning with household level consumption, what people drive, where they live, what they wear.
Hmm.
And you cannot just denounce it all as counter-revolutionary. It can be that. But there's no system of organizing social life that doesn't have to grapple with these very ordinary kinds of everyday concerns. And that's why consumption is so important. It's universal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's a lot that's lost because it's
Mm-hmm.
not weaved into Black studies in an obvious and
Yeah.
theorized way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's also a lot that's lost in terms of liberation movements
Hmm.
because they don't take up the area of consumption as much as, say, in the past. I mean, when we think about that origin moment for the civil rights movement, which I
Hmm.
locate with Montgomery bus boycott,
Hmm.
it's a bus boycott,
Boycott.
right?
Right. Right.
That
Yeah,
speaks
absolutely.
fundamentally to
Right.
those questions. And if you think about it that way, then the argument that the civil rights movement didn't deal with economic issues is
Oh,
misplaced,
oh, absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
Completely
absolutely. Right.
misplaced because it
I
was
would
dealing with
point readers
consumption.
to I would point readers to one of my favorite things that I've read in recent years is a book by a historian, Victoria Walcott, called "Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters."
Oh, great book.
That's a
Absolutely.
great book.
Great
That is an
book.
absolutely great book. And she lays so much of it out, and I think it's done in such a clear way about how these kinds of dilemmas, people trying to get to the community pool, people trying to be on the beach. Man, I didn't know that Six Flags was named after all six flags that
Mm.
have flown over the state of Texas,
Interesting.
including the rebel flag, right, from
Yeah,
the Confederacy, right?
yeah,
That's one of the six.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so these things that this is everyday people don't miss this, right? So we're talking about what has been theorized and in what ways. Um, I think that in terms of trying to rectify this to some degree, there are a couple of things, and I tend to be kind of biased towards small, repeatable actions that can build into something.
Hmm.
I don't oppose the grandiose, but rarely do we start there, right? So I would say one thing we have to do is simply recognize where work on consumers and consumption is already happening. So the Walcott book. I'm also
Hmm.
thinking, where this first hit me, where I knew I was doing the right thing in some ways, was you had Robin D.G. Kelly. I had to be, I want to say, my junior year of college, and Robin had just written Race Rebels.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know how many times I have assigned the last chapter in that book, The Riddle of the Zoot,
Yeah,
where Robin
yeah.
does the close reading on the Zoot suit? That's consumption, right?
Hmm.
That is
Hmm.
exactly what consumption is. So there's lots of stuff in the more recently. I really enjoy, because we were just talking about boycotts. Blair Kelly's book, Right to Ride,
Mm. Yeah,
on
yeah.
consumer boycott, which really in some ways kind of helps usher us into kind of where Montgomery didn't come out the blue, right?
Right, right.
And so and
There's a
Blair
history.
Kelly's book helps us see that, right? That the first bit of activism that Ida B. Wells engaged on was getting kicked off a train.
Brother Frederick Douglass him and another brother beat the hell out of a trolley conductor
Mm-hmm.
in Boston in
Mm-hmm.
1854.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to put them out. But see, I think what
Absolutely.
happens is that the frame for even Walcott's book of when people discuss it, they discuss it as public accommodations without
Right.
thinking about those public accommodations represent industries, and
Yes.
that's the market.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Mm-hmm.
capitalist market.
It absolutely is that, right? One of the interesting insights in Blair Kelly's book that she talks about, and I think this is really crucial, it's this overlay between the marketplace and civil society and everyday
Mm,
politics, right? So she talks about how initially, the trolley makers saw segregation as added cost, right? They didn't want to do that. That wasn't interesting to them. It was more money that they were going to have to spend. It
mm,
was, kind of the dominant coalition of working class and petty bourgeois whites,
mm.
not really elites, that demanded this in the political sphere. And so this kind of sort of backwardness can originate, its genesis can be a lots of places.
That's
Elites
right.
always take advantage of it in the same way, but its actual origins don't necessarily need to lie with elites for it to benefit the capitalist order. Their job is to exploit, and they exploit that. Right.
Dave Roediger's book, Wages of Whiteness,
Absolutely.
did that, though it
Hmm.
focused probably too much on the cultural aspects of it, but it exposed that because the white elites don't necessarily rub shoulders with black folk in
Hmm.
spaces that they don't have complete control over,
Right.
i.e., when you're a domestic servant in their home. But
Hmm.
the public sphere, the public space,
Hmm.
um, working class whites, is what Du Bois said about they get both a material and
Right.
a psychological wage. And
Right.
so they have to throw down in those
Hmm.
spaces to create difference so they can get deference.
There you
Right?
go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Du Bois, matter of fact, Du Bois, in some ways, one of the things that we've sort of left out, to the extent that we talk about the Philadelphia Negro at all, the last chapter of that book is about everyday life.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
about where people live and what they buy,
That's right.
right? You go back through it, right? Like that's what that is. Now, the other thing that I would say probably needs to happen, and I'll take some accountability on our side. We got enough people on my side of the ledger at this point that we need to be more engaged in what's going on in Black studies. We got enough people who do
Yes.
work on race and who do work on Black people, and I'm including myself in this criticism. We've pushed our way, for example, as consumer researchers, into public health discourse. That started with tobacco. That was like some of the
Mm.
first work I did was a little bit on adolescence and tobacco use. And that was, mid to late 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember
When
when
that
you
was,
were doing that work.
yeah,
Yes.
when
Yeah.
that stuff was kind of coming around, and the public health people didn't read us, they didn't cite us, they understood it as a health issue. But what they were actually studying was mostly advertising.
Okay.
And they weren't talking to us at all. And we eventually said, the stuff that you're saying is just dumb. The stuff that you're saying about advertising and how it works is just ill-informed, right? A lot of bad assumptions. And eventually we've kind of pushed our way into that conversation so that now, even with vaccine stuff, one of my colleagues and dear friends, she just published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's about,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, because that's about marketing, right? That's about
Mm.
consumption.
Yeah. Yeah.
Vaccine uptake is a consumer issue.
Absolutely.
We've done
Absolutely.
that stuff, right? And so we could
Yeah.
we could do more to get involved.
So that would be seeking out affiliations and joint
Hmm.
appointments in Black studies.
Right.
And then there's got to be an openness on the part of Black studies. I want to kind of move
Hmm.
in this sphere because it reminds me of one of those shocking facts
Hmm.
that in 2010, there were very few films made starring black folk, right?
Hmm.
And black people had very few roles as secondary characters
Hmm.
in film. And when they did, they were the first ones killed in every horror
Right.
film
In every horror
and
film, right?
in every drama,
Right.
crime
Right.
mystery, right?
Right.
Um, but here's the point: there were more films starring black people and on the black experience made in 1940 than there were in 2010,
Hmm.
right? And so there was a response to that. And that
Hmm.
response has finally opened up, right? So
Hmm.
that while there was some movement between 2010 and 2014, but since the killing of Michael Brown,
Hmm.
there's been a lot of strategies to incorporate black folk into the media.
Hmm.
Since Obama's election, I mean, you never saw a black pundit before Obama ran, right? Now, some of them are
Right.
frankly embarrassing,
Oh,
but
it is that. Right.
they're there. We didn't have them before, so you did that early work in 2008, and this
Hmm.
piece, marketing blackness.
Hmm.
Can you discuss your findings
Sure.
and then answer this kind of question? Have the basic promotional strategies changed since you addressed this question 15 years ago?
Right. So let me talk a little bit about the background in that project. In many ways, one of the reasons I began that project, I started actually working on it with a colleague who had to get off the paper for a variety of reasons. But One of the reasons he and I kind of started with that is just thinking through when the topic came up about advertising. Lots of times the conversation was limited to people sort of looking for stereotypical images, right? So things, that sort of Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben sort of effect. And that's kind of what a lot of folks were focused on. And one of the things that we thought, and I ended up really developing this, is that it misses a lot. And in fact, so that piece came out in the early aughts, and so things were changing, particularly for national brands. There have been several cycles of the Aunt Jemima issue, but companies had lived through some of that. There are related sorts of issues that were cropping up, and for big national brands, it wasn't worth fighting this battle, and so lots of them had kind of gone through their stuff and tried to get rid of a lot of that kind of really negative imagery. And so, because many of the critics of what was going on in advertising and media generally were committed to this explanation, or I should say, committed to a kind of conceptualization of the problem as being about stereotypes and stereotypical images, they were missing a lot of the actual underlying strategy. Like, what is this advertisement trying to get you to do? And unlike my principles of marketing students, in the first week, their answer to that question is always they're trying to get you to buy the product. And I hope by the end of the class that they understand that advertisers kind of hope that that happens, but in the moment, their purposes are much less grandiose, right? Mostly what they want you to do is to remember what you saw. Like, that's, how as professors, we just want you to read the syllabus. If we can get you to do that, advertisers want you to remember what you saw. Like, that's mostly what they're trying to get at. And so how do they do that? So one of the things that we wanted to go through was to sort of think through, look across all of these ads and say, what is it that these ads are trying to accomplish? And what I argued in that paper is that there are a couple of dimensions of strategy that are really important, where you see most of the movement. And so I'll spoil the end by saying I think we got that right. And so I don't think we've seen some differences in emphasis, but the basics, the mechanics of how it works, and that's really what I was trying to get at, I think are pretty solid. So one dimension of difference in ads is that advertisers are trying to make a claim to their hailed viewer, whoever it is they're really trying to attract. They're trying to make a claim that you, the viewer, is either similar to what you're seeing or different from what you're seeing. Like, a lot of what people miss about why Aunt Jemima was effective in the 1800s is that those folks, the hailed viewer for them was kind of the everyday white person. And Aunt Jemima was the polar opposite of them, right? That was that product. If you don't understand what Aunt Jemima pancake mix promised its customers, that's really not good. Like, what you need to understand that pancake mix was a technological innovation, right? It was self-rising flour, which was a big deal. And so that product was promising the marketplace slave-like devotion. So Aunt Jemima was there to be different than the hailed viewer, right? So you can be different from what you're seeing or similar to what you're seeing. The other kind of claim that advertisers make involves the use of Blackness itself, when they are using Blackness related representations or materials. That's not just images, that's also music, that's speech, African American vernacular English, any of those things that are indicative and indications of Black culture. They're making a claim that Blackness itself is either central to that promise. Blackness was central to the promise that Aunt Jemima was making to its customers of slave-like devotion. She was a slave, right? So that promise can be, or blackness can be central to that promise, or it can be incidental to that promise, which is actually most of the ads that you see that have any sort of blackness representation in it is just a blanket kind of diversity. Advertisers know that people like ads that have some level of diversity, so they do those things. So if you take these two dimensions of difference, there are places where they cross. And so I mapped out a set of strategies, too intricate to go into here, but I mapped out a set of strategies based on what kind of claim is the company making. Now, contemporarily, like I said, I think we got the mechanics right. And so what's changing over time is, are companies making claims about similarity to the viewer or difference from the viewer? I would say that they're not directly comparable, but on the whole, I think what has happened in the Black Lives Matter moment is that claims of similarity have become more prevalent. And that kind of gets to what you were talking about, Sundiata, with the inclusion of more black oriented themes, more black actors, all that sort of stuff. Now, claims about kind of how blackness is related to the product itself, those just vary widely. They vary based on a lot of things, and so I wouldn't really speak to that in any general sense. But I think we basically got that right. Yeah. So let me stop there. See if you have any follow up, because that was a lot.
Yeah, I do. I mean, that was concise and made perfect sense, and I can tell by comments that people are getting it.
Hmm.
Um, I got a question about class, and what
Hmm.
I'm wondering is this:
Hmm.
if the ads in the Black Lives Matter moment,
Hmm.
are they more directed at this expansive group of wealthy blacks, and not so much at the median of
Hmm.
working class black folk than previous eras of advertisement? And the reason I say that, now I love Regina King. I think the work she's doing.
Hmm.
When you think about the 7 seconds piece she did for Netflix, and of
Hmm.
course, the Watchmen. I mean,
Right.
my,
Hmm.
uh, such a wonderful piece of work. But
Hmm.
her Cadillac commercial,
Hmm.
the Escalade,
Hmm.
uh, clearly is a class
Right.
statement, and there's a lot of similar type ads
Hmm.
that you don't see that we didn't see historically.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering if that's if that's the trend.
Right. So I think let me speak generally, and then maybe a little bit more directly to those examples. So generally, this is the kind of thing where it all depends on who the advertiser is. You could imagine that a luxury brand, a Cadillac, a Lexus, right? They're already speaking to a very different kind of consumer, right? And so the real change is that now they are including blackness in that appeal, right? And so to the extent that we've seen something different, it's that those kinds of brands, those kinds of firms are now more open to having to airing something that has a very explicit sort of black appeal to it. I'm hesitant to kind of just average all of that out, right? You could see how Lexus and Cadillac are different than Hellman's mayonnaise and Pampers diapers, right? The products are just different. So that's one thing we want to make sure that we're trying to account for. Um, but then let me speak to kind of these specific sorts of things. I think what has happened, interestingly enough, let me start by saying, we are blessed to have Brother Jared Ball doing the work that he's doing,
Yeah.
because I have seen the multi-trillion-dollar consumer buying power statistic for far too long. And I will say that in many respects, it is it's not just an article of faith in Black America. It's also an article of faith among firms.
Yeah.
And so they
Yeah.
do recognize that there is, right now, there is higher wealth concentration within Black America than we have ever seen.
That's right.
Right.
And in
So
fact, the gap within the intraracial gap is
Mhm.
greater than the interracial gap.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it tends to be that way. It's the same way for Asians and for
Right.
Latinx people.
Right.
So I guess just to kind of pull this string a little bit more,
Mhm.
um, does this mean when a brand like Cadillac
Mhm.
uh, puts Regina King and makes that probably their most prominent commercial,
Mhm.
does that mean not just that they now recognize that there's a set of wealthy Black folk to market to, but that they're convinced that they're not turning off the white market?
Right. Right. That, excuse me. That's actually kind of an age-old question, right? Um, so, and boy, it's been a bit since I've seen this research, but I'll tell you what I can recall of it. So that is the question. Like when you target a non-white group in an ad, what do white viewers feel about the
Yeah.
ad, right? Companies want to know. So at least the old stuff, and I don't know that there's anything different on this, is that for the most part, we're pretty sure that it's not harmful, right? In terms of from the
Okay.
advertiser's perspective, right? That they're
Yeah.
probably not losing anything. That what's most likely to happen is that two things, right? So two outcomes I think are the most common, right? One is that people just code it as diversity, and they just kind of have a generally positive halo for that sort of thing.
Okay.
Seeing it on TV. The other thing is that they don't code it at all, right? So it just becomes one of like,
Oh,
that ad is not for me. That is what white viewers will
okay.
often
So they
think,
just
and so it's never in their consideration set. I do think that there are moments where there can be departures there for particular kinds of brands, but we're just sort of talking overall. There's one other thing that I think is worth kind of saying about this moment, and here I want to credit Jason Chambers.
oh, okay.
Jason at U of I, Urbana
Yeah, yeah,
Champaign,
yeah.
who's a long time in the communications. I was in a presentation that Jason did maybe a couple springs ago. No, last spring it was. Last
Okay.
spring it was. And one of the points that he made that I thought was so salient is here and kind of look back across multiple decades, what we see is that the Black Lives Matter moment was not unlike the racial unrest of the very late 60s, early 70s, was not like the racial unrest of the Montgomery bus boycott era. It's like in each of those, we saw that there was a moment, and Jason speculates that it's about every 10 years or so.
Yeah.
There's a moment where society generally and advertisers, as part of that, are ready to talk a little bit about race, recognize inequality, those sorts of things. But those moments tend to be fairly fleeting. Um,
I think that he's right
mhm.
generally, but it's not as frequent as every decade. It's a generation. It's once a generation, man.
Now it depends on how much you want to measure, kind of like what the bump is. I mean, he presented some
Yeah.
data on it, and I mean, he's looking at these. There's some fine grain.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
not an explosion. Let's just say that,
Okay.
right?
Okay. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah. Um, so switching up a bit,
Hmm.
uh, but I'm still coming off of that marketing blackness
Yeah.
paper,
Hmm.
and so one of the pieces that really intrigued me was that you went to Stewart Hall, and it's not unusual for people to go to Stewart Hall,
Hmm.
but what you took from Hall was a notion of blackness being concrete,
Hmm.
its materiality,
Hmm.
so that the discussion became social historical experience and traditions that come out of a concrete community a
Mhm.
people, right?
Mhm.
A nation
Mhm.
within a nation kind of
Mhm.
thing, where much of the discussion of blackness in Black Africana studies
Mhm.
is abstract, ethereal.
Mhm.
And one of the things that also struck me is that by definition, then, because you're dealing with concrete communities,
Right.
um, there's a collectiveness there.
Mhm.
They're talking about collectivities, and I'm just reminded by this comment by Henry Louis Gates, where Gates says that there are 42 million ways to be black,
Hmm.
and I'm like, I'm gonna give you several, but god damn, that's one for each of us.
Right, right. Right,
So tell me about the choice to go
right.
collective and to go with a materiality as opposed
Sure.
to just run down the abstract cultural rabbit hole.
Sure. Well, and so I'll simply start by saying that um, I'm probably engaged in a somewhat different theoretical project than some of the folks who are talking about blackness in very different ways. And so, kind of off the bat, it's I have no interest in sort of disagreeing, right? I'm working on something different
Mm,
than they're working on, and
right.
so in some easy to sort of digest ways, the study of consumers and consumption is pretty much by definition a study of material culture, right?
Hmm.
I'm looking at kind of what people do at basically a very particular site, the marketplace, which precedes the capitalist order and will be around after capitalism is done. But at this particular moment, it's a marketplace embedded in a capitalist mode of production and larger social order, right? And so, because that's the theoretical project that I'm engaged in, abstract doesn't really help me.
Okay. Yeah.
Right,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
not sort of. I don't want to kind of be a denialist and say that, because I think that there are people who are engaged in kind of trying to explore blackness in its fullness.
Yeah.
Fair
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
But my interest is in understanding it as it is rooted in a very specific socio-historical context, and as it is rooted in very specific practices that we see in the everyday. And so I will simply say that that's my scope of interest, and there is possible to have other scopes, but I think
Absolutely.
this one is crucial.
My main point was simply to say that we obviously have to look at things from a variety of lenses,
Sure.
but we've got to have this lens that's more materially oriented, that
Absolutely.
used to be the centerpiece
Hmm.
of the study of Black
Hmm.
folk, right? If
Hmm.
we're looking at the work of Du Bois,
Yeah. Yeah.
and coming forward, that has now, that stuff has become marginal.
Right.
The materiality has become
Hmm.
more marginal. And so
Hmm.
I'm just hoping that there's a trend that's bringing it back in. We see it with some of the work around housing,
Right.
Keonga Taylor's work.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, uh,
And
so,
that's, and I'm on board with that. I mean, absolutely. So let me even say this a little bit stronger, so that it comes through. I think this kind of project is absolutely critical for the liberation piece,
yes,
right? So, other people can do what they want, but I engage in this kind of research and in the other kinds of things that I do to change material conditions. Um, and so that's my focus. That's what I'm here for.
so Dave, there's an activist. You are, in the Robert Christman tradition,
Hmm.
a Black scholar activist.
Hmm.
So talk about some of your current activism,
Hmm.
but I want you to relate it to your scholarship,
Sure.
right? There are
Hmm.
some people who get engaged in activism, but it's not an extension
Mm-hmm.
of their intellectual project.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about it in those terms, what you've been doing
Mm-hmm.
and how it connects with your overall intellectual project?
Sure, sure. So I will talk kind of like in a couple of different segments. So the stuff that I've been doing in civil society and some of the stuff, some of the work that I've done with companies as well. So I'll talk, I don't want to label that as activism. That is not activism, but I
Mhm.
just want to talk about it kind of as part of a larger project that I'm working on. So, in my community, so right now I'm sitting in my house in Columbia, South Carolina. So the things that I've been working on for the past couple years, I had been engaged in what was a local chapter of Black Lives Matter. Um, but I think like a lot of folks have found the support for the local chapters in many respects kind of fell apart for a variety of reasons. We did a lot of educational programming around here, and we focused on addressing bail, specifically cash bail, which I know, thank you to all the activists out in Illinois, is now a thing of the past in the great state of Illinois. So, right on for that. It ain't like that in South Carolina. You don't want to get locked up anywhere, but you really don't want to get locked up in South Carolina. And so, we started engaging in kind of bail work, but really just kind of trying to help people understand how the system works, where that money comes from, where it goes, those sorts of things. And eventually, as that sort of faded, myself and a number and people in some other local organizations, Sister from Party for Socialism and Liberation, and a number of other progressive groups, we got together really as the protests began. In the spring of 2020, the late spring of 2020, we got together just to do a bail fund because people were getting arrested. And so that bail fund is kind of taken off. It's called the Soda City Bail Fund. We're accepting donations. SodaCityBail.org. Help some brothers and sisters out. So we've been engaged in a community bail fund that has, an anti-prison, anti-jail, abolitionist politics underlying it. And so that's really for the last year plus what has taken up most of my time locally. They were arresting people throughout the pandemic, and so that's kind of what we're doing. So that's sort of a piece, and part of the reason that I'm engaged in that struggle and kind of where it hopefully will lead in terms of doing more work, research oriented work. I've gotten interested in how cash bail works, and how those companies kind of come to be. In South Carolina, they have a very powerful lobby.
Mm.
And so the kinds of bails that of you, they might knock your socks off. I can't remember the last time we paid a sub four-figure bail for anything. Most of our bails are $5,000 and up, for almost trivial sorts of things. And my intuition is that that's a bit of a nod to that industry.
Yeah.
Which is it's a very interesting industry. I don't even want to get off on a tangent here, but do you know those people see themselves as kind of liberators, right? Like you get to pay them so they can grant you their freedom, right? It's like having a toll on the Underground Railroad, right? Like that's how they see themselves, right?
Wow.
Yeah, it's deep, and I know it's not just here. Our bail fund is part of the National Bail Fund Network, and we're hearing the same stories everywhere. And a lot of bails went up overnight during the protests. A lot of things,
Hmm.
charges got multiplied, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the work that I'm engaged in locally. Um, I mentioned that I've done some work for firms. I actually did a fairly lengthy study commissioned by Sephora, the giant makeup retailer. So there I worked with a sociologist by the name of Cassie Pittman. Cassie's a professor of sociology at Case Western in Cleveland. So long story short, that company has had myriad issues with racialized incidents in its stores, right? And so, in a very concrete way, we have to do something about that, right? Like people can't go into stores and get harassed, right? They just,
Right.
like that,
Right.
on some level, like we have to deal with it on that, in that sort of very
Mm-hmm.
concrete way. And so, Sephora, to its credit, they worked with a kind of community board. It's not their board of directors, but it's kind of a community based board that kind of gives them advice on some of these issues. And so one of the things they had to do was to try to put some detail on what happens in their stores,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? When people walk in, what sorts of things do they value, what, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was really a year-long effort that began mostly before the shutdown, before everything, the shutdown. We went out there and talked to them. And Cassie and I did a lot of the intellectual legwork on putting together research design for a study that a market research firm then mostly conducted. Um, Qualitative stuff, we talked to consumers, a huge survey that includes consumers, that included employees, not just for the company, but retail employees generally. A lot of data with some really good insights, but more than that, a very specific action plan. Actually, if for those of you who might be interested, you can go on to Sephora's website. They have a diversity, equity, and inclusion page, and you can see the plan, which they update pretty frequently. And a lot of it was concrete steps, right? Like these are the sorts of
Mm-hmm.
things that we're going to do. This is how we're going to change our training. This is how we're going to handle these situations. A lot of the issues, as you can imagine, that they run into are with what they call loss prevention, right? They're security personnel,
Mm-hmm.
and that stuff is all outsourced. And so,
Okay.
what they never had was a very specific and written set of standards about what they expect from those companies. If you want this contract, this is how your people will have to be. So those kinds of things, which, frankly, it hadn't been done, it needed to be done. So that's the kind of stuff that I've been engaged in.
Okay. Good. Good.
Yeah.
So,
And
Dave.
let me add one
Yeah.
last sentence to
Yeah.
that because I know where we're headed. Some of that stuff is what came out in my most recent piece on racial formation. Because what I wanted to do in that piece, kind of taking all of this stuff together, was to zoom out from what people are calling discrimination, which,
Mm-hmm.
discrimination it's a legal term of art. It's like murder, right? Like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we all kind of know what it means, but it's actually more ambiguous than you think. And so what I've tried to do is kind of zoom out from there and think about, at the level of the marketplace writ large, what is racial inequality? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where produced and reproduced and challenged in the marketplace. So that's kind of where a lot of that stuff, it ended up in that paper.
Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. And like you say, you know where we're going.
Right.
So, in many ways, and I I see the racial oppression and racial projects in consumer markets, a racial formation theory approach, as probably the piece that sums up the essence of the work that you've been doing,
Mm-hmm.
and at this point, it's probably your magnum opus. It's the piece
Mm-hmm.
that says this is Dave Crockett mapping out a new way, a new paradigm. I'm launching a new paradigm. So, can you talk about that piece, what you're attempting to do, and
Sure.
what it does do, and why it is a great leap forward? As
Mm-hmm.
C.L.R. James used to say, leap, leap, leap. This is the leap. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This ain't no step.
Right.
This is a leap.
Right. Right. Well, I appreciate you saying that. That I'll just start a little bit, just talking about kind of background. And I should note here too that my discipline is an article discipline. We largely do not write books. Um, so it favors the sort of precision and timeliness of articles over the depth of books, sometimes to its detriment. But I like kind of the way this is, because something comes out within a couple of years as opposed to like 10, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. So in many ways, let me just kind of set this up by helping people understand the problem I think I'm trying to solve, right? So on the one hand, when it comes to what happens in markets, the predominant way, and remember, I said that for Black people, what happens in the marketplace is the thing, right? Like that's the site where they see the most unfair treatment. And so the thing is, we hadn't really theorized it very well. We mostly talk about discrimination, and discrimination is not that that's wrong. But it is somewhat inadequate to think about what happens to people in the marketplace. Discrimination, in most crucial respects, is interpersonal. That's the security personnel who stares at you and follows you around, but doesn't do it to other people. That's the person working the cash register who throws the change on the conveyor but won't put it in your hand, right? And so it really bespeaks this interpersonal kind of dynamic. But that's not the only thing that happens in the market. And we have a really difficult time thinking about how and why that is the case. So let me give you kind of a key sort of theoretical dilemma. Years ago, actually an economist, a guy named Ian Ayres, did some work on what happens when Black people shop for cars. And long story short, they end up paying about 1% to 2% more. This is when you walk onto a car lot. You pay about 1% to 2% more than white people. And it's about the same gap for women of any race over white males. And so, for a typical $20,000 car, that's a couple extra $100, right? Like that's materiality, right? You wouldn't set $200 on fire. And so what's the explanation for that? In many ways, what's interesting is that Ian Ayres didn't know, right? He didn't have a story for what happens, because typically what we would say is that, you walk onto the lot, the car salesperson sees you, and we know Ian was able to discover the mechanism. The mechanism is that salespeople are more likely to anchor on sticker price for Black people and women of any race than they are for white men. That's what actually happens. They won't move off sticker for us, but they will move off sticker for white people. And so there you go, right? But the thing that Ian found was that the race of the salesperson didn't matter. You were seeing the same effect whether the salesperson was Black or white. Now, there's some people who, for a variety of reasons, accept the same kinds of stereotypes that about Black people that white people have about Black people. But across 100% of the cases, right? Like that doesn't add up. So what is going on? I honestly, I don't know. I think it has something to do with actually the compensation mechanism in stores, but the whole in car dealerships. But the whole point here is that we don't know a lot about how racial inequality in the marketplace comes to be. We mostly assume that it's just people doing bad things. And you know what? That's an inadequate explanation. And so this is kind of what started me on this project to try to help explain this whole thing. So I think briefly what I can do is kind of talk about two ways of thinking about racial formation theory. And interestingly enough, I'm really familiar with and have utilized critical race theory. And this is kind of a part of the domain of critical race theory. But I thought racial formation theory was actually a little bit better suited for this context. So what I'm able to show is that part of the way that
Hey, let me
racial
get you to pull
inequality
back.
is okay.
Let me get you pulled back. I
Yeah,
don't know that our audience knows what racial formation theory is.
sure.
So give them some
Okay.
background and
Right. And so there are, because there are a couple of different racial formation theories. Let me just say kind of generally that it's a way of thinking about how race and subsequently racism come to be in a particular place at a particular time. Now, there are kind of two dominant approaches. Um, the most dominant one comes from sociology. There are a couple of sociologists, Michael Omi and Howard Winant, who argue that this is part of kind of like culture and the level of discourse, that race comes to be as a fight between political entities over meaning. And then meaning and subsequently status is assigned to particular groups of people, and there are resources that flow from that. And part of what they do is sort of show the ways that resources flow from that. Now, another approach to racial formation actually comes from a historian, and has been actually, I would say,
Harold
um,
Barron.
Harold Barron, and updated by our own Dr. Cha-Jua. So I was looking for the word updated. Yeah, updated by our own Dr. Cha-Jua. And it takes a much more structural approach. It talks about how race and racism develop as a function of both history, right, the moment that we are in, but also sociality, like what people are doing and how they are engaged with each other. Now, ages ago, when I was first exposed to both these kinds of theories, Sundiata was talking about kind of the version that he thinks about, and I was at the same time I was taking a sociology class where I got exposure to the other theory, and I always believed in my heart that those two theories could talk to each other, but they didn't, and it's kind of taken me the rest of my career to get them to talk to each other. And so in some ways, this is kind of what I do. So in a nutshell, what I think I'm able to show, it's a conceptual paper. So what I think I'm able to show is that in the historical moment that we are definitely in, that historians talk about as the new nadir, that Sundiata talks about, what happens in markets is that they develop in a very particular way. And that is largely defined by some very durable features that repeat themselves over and over and over. So one of them has to do with what people call the racial spatial divide, right? So Black people are never in the places where the good resources are, right? The good stores are always somewhere where we are not. But not just the stores, right? Access to credit, all kinds of things. Lots of things have to be divvied up geographically, right? And Black people tend to be clustered in the places, right? So you have that as a feature. Another feature that we talked a little bit about is the racial wealth and income gaps. Another feature is what we might call stigma. And kind of basic discrimination, right? So stigma is about why they are following you at the store when you go in, right? They have some thoughts about what Black people are likely to do. And then the last of these we call predatory inclusion. If you know Keeanga Yamada Taylor's work, Race for Profit, but there's some other works as well that get into that Black people are not simply excluded from the marketplace anymore. They are frequently included in the marketplace on terms that are predatory. All these paycheck cashing places that are clustered in Black America, they sell you predatory loans, right? And so those four features of the marketplace in the United States, I argue, is where we must begin, right? If we want to understand racial inequality, those four features are basically ever present. And so Black people and other people of color come to the marketplace already way behind because of these features of where they are, these features of this historical moment. And then on top of that, there are these kinds of interpersonal things that we were talking about a little bit before that help distribute resources. So I'll give you an example. And these are called racial projects. That comes from Omi and Wynant. So I'll give you an example. The sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom, she has this term that we've all seen these white people go berserk in restaurants, in stores, at the movie theater, and so forth, right? Be it mask mandates, dealing with other, it's not even just about race. The argument in many ways is that it's in the marketplace that your whiteness is most felt, is best rewarded for everyday people, not the elites, for everyday people. It's folks looking the other way when you're doing stuff that you're not supposed to be doing. It's the kind of deference that you get from employees that work in the place. Like those little petty privileges, right, become the essence of what Du Bois was talking about. And they happen in the marketplace. Now, without all of that structure, it might be annoying, but it might not produce real lasting inequality. But on top of all that structure, the predatory inclusion, the stigma, the racial wealth gap, the racial spatial divide, what you get is enduring inequality. On the flip side, you have racial projects that are intended to offset this stuff, right? Sometimes, like a company like Sephora, like at least in this narrow set of things, they trying to do the right thing, right? Because it will help them make money. And so they engage in these kinds of racial projects, these advertisements that we were just talking about, right? Incorporating more Black people, explicitly saying Black Lives Matter on the website, right? These are racial projects, but there is no structure underlying them. And so their impact tends to be quite fleeting. And so the seesaw is always tipped in the same direction, right? It's always, though there's so much more weight that supports white supremacy as an outcome than there is a weight to support the challenges to white supremacy.
Yeah, that sums it up wonderfully. So we've got about 18 minutes.
Okay.
And I want to open up I got a couple of questions. So what I'm going to do is go to the questions first, and then we'll come back. So one question, well, actually both questions that I have are extremely specific.
Okay.
So one, coming from Sounds of Saint Elsewhere, they're asking if you can speak to the relationship between the toy industry and Black consumers.
That's interesting. And shout out to Saint Elsewhere. Like that's old school. So the toy industry is an interesting one, and I serve as an associate editor for one of our journals, and I was actually reviewing a paper that someone just wrote on this topic. So this is not my work, but I just came across something that I thought was pretty fascinating. The toy industry is an interesting one insofar as they, in many ways, find themselves kind of caught betwixt and between. So this person talked about these kind of Playmobil characters. It's the small little people. And that, you can put them in sets with the pirate ship and so forth. And at one point there was a controversy because there was a person of color. They were painted brownish, and they were enslaved on a pirate ship. And
Oh,
so
I
someone put up a, you may remember this, right? And so someone
yeah.
put up a
Oh yeah.
Facebook post like, what are they doing? I'm like, this is insane. Like, and this is after 2000 and 2000 whatever. Why are we still seeing this, right? And that post met with an inevitable kind of backlash, right? And so the project was all about kind of how the company manages this, because on the one hand, they bill themselves as really taking history seriously, right? And so, we want to present things in their accuracy, and sometimes that means that people could be offended, yada yada yada,
Mhm.
right? But at the same time, they idealize in particular ways, right, because of the audience. And so
Mhm.
the paper was really about kind of how this company tries to navigate these really complex waters, um, and to do so, largely without
Mhm.
making real change, right?
Right.
So how do you how do you shut up the complainers, but also without giving carte blanche to the sort of fascist backlash, right? Because that will
Mhm.
also invite its own negative publicity. And so, what I kind of where I would sort of think about this is that the toy industry recognizes, the toy industry makes its money off cultural power,
Mhm.
right? Why do people buy specific toys for their kids? Right? Because those toys have cultural power at a given moment. And for most toys, that moment is really quite fleeting, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's here today. And so those companies they got to catch it like while it's happening, and they got to do it in a way that they're not also killing it
Mm.
at the same time, right? And as it concerns matters of race and racism, it's a very difficult needle for them to try to thread, because their hail consumer is working and middle class white people. They buy the most toys, but it is often other people that give toys their cultural power. Right?
Yeah.
The cultural power doesn't come from middle class life. It comes from
Right.
other kinds of lives,
Yeah.
right? That may be real or they may be imagined. They may be fantasy lives, but they don't come from middle class whiteness. And so the companies cannot disavow those things. And at the same time, they've got to keep their customers happy, right? And that's sort of the insight there. But a lot of the stuff that you see that comes out, what's going on with toys, you can sort of think
Mhm.
about it. You can use that lens to make it make
Yeah.
sense.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Now the
Hmm.
next question again, it's a very specific question.
Hmm.
Tom Burrell, the probably the most famous black advertiser.
Yeah.
His book Brainwashed,
Hmm.
and I just simply want to know: is it relevant to your work? The kinds of insights that
Yeah.
he discusses. How is it relevant to what you do?
So I would mostly abstract. So let me be clear. So what Burrell is telling you about in that book is mostly about advertisers. It's been a while since I looked at it, but it's mostly about advertisers, as I recall, right? And my theoretical project is somewhat different. I actually had a really good conversation, not with Tom Burrell. I don't have that
Mm,
kind of juice, but I did talk to some people from the agency. This has been many, many years
mm,
ago, just kind of about the work that they were doing and what was changing at the who study advertisers more expressly than I do. And
mm,
so when I say that it's not my work, because I imagine if you watching this show, academics, and we're all
mm,
quite narrow, right? I know a
mm.
lot about a little bit of stuff, and my stuff is mostly consumers. Actually, it's funny. I did that one paper on blackness in advertising,
Yes,
which was supposed to be a one-off. I think that might be my most cited paper, but I largely don't work on advertising.
yes.
I'm interested in what consumers are doing day to day.
Okay. All right. That being said,
Mhm.
to kind of begin to wrap this up. So,
Sure.
Dave, last week. we had 3 court cases decided.
Mm-hmm.
The Rittenhouse, I'm gonna call them murders. The murderers of Ahmaud Arbery
Mm-hmm.
and the 2017 Unite the Right rally. That all
Right.
those went to court and decisions was reached. So, and then this week we had this white supremacist group called the Patriotic Front
Mm-hmm.
march in D.C. I guess trying to recreate the Klan March of 1923, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of get your interpretation of the
Yeah.
rise of the fascist right in the United States, and what does these court decisions tell us? What's the lessons that we should take away?
You know, so you're never supposed to answer a question with a question, but I think I'm going to do it here. And in some ways, my question to you is whether we have reached a new nadir.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, like I think
yeah,
that's a
yeah,
really
yeah,
it's an
yeah.
important question. I don't know that I have an answer to it. I think what the way that I would sort of think about this is I think any reasonable analysis of this moment, if you zoom out, um, let me just take a very brief aside. The Elizabeth Hinton book that came out about
Mm,
kind of all the violence in the 1980s, looked at both
yeah,
Miami riots and rebellions, excuse me.
mm.
Um, I was reading that this summer, and like that's my childhood, and I had
Right, right.
forgotten so much of that stuff. It just sort of blended into the background of the 1980s and early 90s, right? Um, and I think the era that we're in, when you talk about the rise of the right, it has the same kind of feel. I was a PhD student at
Mm-hmm,
University of
mm-hmm.
Arizona in the 1990s, and folks were acting up on the border then.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now has been going on at a reasonably high level for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what we are noticing is its uptake in mainstream information
Yeah.
venues, particularly like legacy media, and so forth. And because of that, I'm not sure that there is an interpretation of these cases. They are more data about things that we've already seen. I've seen some political scientists and some historians I have called this a white nationalist revolt, one that is largely led by the petty bourgeoisie. I have
Yeah,
seen people
yeah.
speculate that, 2008 is really when you ought to date it. But, I know these things won't be settled for quite some time. I think what is interesting about this, so really the phenomena of interest to me is the uptake, right?
Right,
Like
right,
this stuff
right.
has been ignored for a long time, and now it has sort of emerged as being somewhat important. Why? Who's asking the questions? How are they framing those questions? Um, the part of the phenomena that I think it has been most intriguing, in some ways, the most disappointing, is to the extent that there's any sort of liberal consensus left in the United States, that consensus seems to continually come down in the same place, that a little bit of fascism and white supremacy
Mm-hmm.
is always preferable to a politically left
Mm-hmm.
multiracial social democracy. Because
Yeah.
the spring of 2020, that's what we were seeing play out.
Yes,
That it
yes.
was not just Black lives, obviously a big part of it, but what was happening was a lot of people weren't working. A lot of people weren't engaged in that kind of day-to-day drudgery, and they had an opportunity to look around and say, these people don't care whether I live or die.
Mm-hmm.
A whole lot of people thought their whiteness bought them longer lifespan.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, what we've been seeing is no, it doesn't. No, it does not. And so some people had gotten to the place where they were beginning to realign and think very differently about how they saw the world. They saw the injustices going on, and I think in a very visceral way,
Mm,
many people saw that there, but for the grace of God, as the old folks
yeah.
used to say, right, go I, and they were out in the streets about it, right? Because Corona was
Oh
killing,
yeah. Oh yeah.
right? So all of
Yeah.
these things have kind of happened. That moment gets shut down, right? That moment was vamped on, and it wasn't just the
Quickly.
Trump administration, right?
Right.
That moment was brutal, right?
Hmm.
Um, and since that time, we have seen not just old-fashioned voter suppression, we have seen takeover of the election process, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, if
Yeah.
it's if y'all don't vote for who we want, the right has
Yeah.
said, we will simply nullify the election, right? We
Yeah.
setting everything up to do that.
Yeah.
And what has the response been? It hasn't been, wait, we can't do this. It has been, well, maybe it won't be so bad.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Mhm,
Absolutely. Um, I do think that in terms of when you said the new nadir,
mhm,
there are definitely new aspects to it. Colorblind racial ideology
mhm,
may still be dominant,
mhm.
but it's quickly losing ground to a resurgence of old 19th
Right,
century. They are inferior people.
right, right.
That is on the rise.
Mhm, right.
So ideologically, there's that challenge, and where I think unemployment was the dominant characteristic in the first
Mhm.
3 quarters of what I call the new nadir, because I'm dating it from '79
Right,
forward.
right.
But
Mhm,
in the last 5, 6 years, thinking about Amazon, they've built south of Chicago. They have these massive warehouses. They're little
mhm,
cities, man,
mhm,
and all of the work is part time.
mhm.
So
Oh yeah.
subproletarianization
Mhm.
is definitely come to characterize not just the black working class now,
No, no.
but the entirety
Mhm.
of the economy is there, and I think that is some of that squeeze is
Mhm.
what's being felt by the
Right.
white working class, and
Mhm.
it is interesting, as you say, that these fascist movements are not rooted in the white working class; they're
They
rooted
really are
in the
not.
white petty bourgeoisie.
Yes, they are.
But see, Nazism was rooted in the petty bourgeoisie.
That's right.
Italian fascism was
Yep.
rooted in the petty
Mhm.
bourgeoisie. Small business people, you take a look at Congress. There was a time when I had a certain level of respect. Of course, I opposed them, but
Mhm.
they were intelligent conservatives in
Mhm.
Congress,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And you could have a debate with them on issues.
Mhm.
Now, these people, they were clerks or some bullshit.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
and small, very low, small business owners,
Mhm.
franchise capitalists,
Mhm.
and now they're in Congress, and they've never understood anything other than a profit sheet.
Yeah.
Uh, they're now making law. And this
Mhm.
is the kind of law that they have always made when they
Mhm.
rose through what they called the redemption and overthrew
Mhm.
Reconstruction. This is the same class
It's the
of white
same
folk,
class.
same
Yes, it
class of
is.
white folk now.
Mhm.
And so they're doing that, and that does suggest to me that I've been trying to think about how to re-theorize and pick up these new trends that they haven't completely consolidated yet.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's,
Mhm.
but we can see them beginning to gel in a fascistic
Yes.
manner. We're
Yeah.
not talking hair invoked democracy or democracy of the white folks.
Mm.
We're talking now an elite
Mhm.
takeover
Mhm.
of government, a
Yeah.
coup. We're genuinely talking a
Absolutely.
corporate coup.
Uh-huh.
So yeah,
Right.
yeah, we all got to go back to the drawing table on this
Yeah,
one.
we really do. I always tell people in 2016, I had to go out to Orange County. I have a colleague at UC Irvine's. We had to do some work. I was coming back to South Carolina, and I ended up getting stuck at LAX all day. You know how that can happen, right?
Oh yeah, that's brutal, boy.
Yeah, it's brutal, right? And so a guy just sort of chatted me up. We were talking, and I spent a good bit of the day. This is pre-election. A good bit of the day talking to an Orange County, California eye doctor who was a
Mm.
Trump supporter. So we were chatting. The guy was nice enough.
Yeah, yeah,
So we
yeah.
chatted for a long time, and that was at that moment. It was before, they were. This is August, right? And so people were still pretty convinced that
Mm.
Trump could possibly win, and it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
that interaction that let me know. You know what? This dude is probably gonna win. That this was a
Mm.
guy who was upper middle class, certainly, without much working class to him, not an affectation, no nothing.
Mm.
And it was, he was the kind of angry white dude that Mike Davis talks about in City of New
Yeah,
York.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
About it was taxes, it was this, that was that, and so he understood Trump as being on his team. I joked with that guy. He said, there's something about Trump being a businessman. And I joked with that dude. I said, Donald Trump lost money on football and gambling in America. How good of a businessman
Man,
could you possibly be? And the guy cracked up laughing. But he said, yeah, but still, right? Because he understood that Trump was on his team. And the other elites, the Jeb Bushes, that those folks were not. I've said from the start that those people made Trump. He read the room and those other people didn't.
That's right. That's
you
right.
know and so yeah, we have seen that. And so what we've seen is that when there was the possibility of multiracial democracy, not only was that put down by the forces of the right, but that happened in a way that was largely unopposed in the liberal consensus. And
Absolutely.
that the fascistic reaction to the moment that we are in has been allowed to grow organically. And if
Yes.
there's something that these court cases in some ways kind of help put a period on, like a coda to it, it's that, on the one hand, maybe we are not quite at the moment of being able to claim slave catcher laws
Yeah.
to allow us to murder people. We're not quite there yet. Georgia does have a huge movie and tourism industry, so
Yeah.
you can't have that. But we are at the point where you can go get a gun if you're a white kid. You can go get a gun, go looking for trouble, find some, shoot your way out of it,
Right.
and you might not eat. You will be allowed to turn yourself in.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And we should all be afraid and energized to organize. And we need a clearer understanding of where we are.
Absolutely.
Dave, it's been wonderful. We will pick up our next discussion on those things that we care a lot about.
No doubt.
No doubt.
No doubt, man.
As
Give
we
my best to
suffer,
Helen.
I shall, and you do the same, my brother.
All
So
right.
let me remove you, and we are out of here. This has been Real Talk: History as a Weapon for Black Liberation with Sundiata, Keita, Cha-Jua, and my guest was a wonderful scholar, David Crockett. And let me say